Grant Whitmore stood at the kitchen counter of his Chicago penthouse at 6 in the morning, watching the coffee drip, and thought about his daughter's hands. She had her mother's hands. That was the first thing he'd noticed when Cecile was born. The long fingers, the particular way the knuckles sat, like her mother Diane's. Diane had been gone 11 years now. Grant had spent those 11 years building the kind of company that required decisions before breakfast and forgave nothing after lunch. What he had not spent those years doing, and what he understood now in the particular silence of a kitchen that a housekeeper cleaned and a chef stocked and no one actually lived in, was teaching his children what any of it cost. 3 envelopes sat on the granite counter, $100 each. That was all. He had spent 6 weeks planning this. He had called his attorney. He had spoken to his bank's security division. He had arranged temporary suspension of 3 credit lines, 3 phone data plans reduced to calls only, and 1 gate code changed at 4 in the morning while the city was still dark. His children did not know any of this. They knew only what he'd told them at dinner the previous Sunday, that they each had 1 week, 1 envelope, and whatever they could carry. His oldest, Fletcher, was 31. He ran the acquisitions division at Whitmore Capital with a title that had been custom-made for him and a team that had learned which questions not to ask. His middle child, a son named Douglas, was 28 and had been telling people for 3 years that he was building something in the fintech space. The building had produced no product, no revenue, and a monthly wire transfer from Grant that Douglas called his operating budget. His youngest, a daughter named Nora, was 24. She had taken a job as a caseworker at a family services nonprofit on the South Side for $34,000 a year. Grant had offered her a role at Whitmore Capital 4 times. She had declined each time without apology and had shown up to every Sunday dinner since, asked questions he didn't expect, and listened in a way that made him realize, after about 6 months of it, that she was the only person in his family who did. He had watched all 3 of them for a year before he made up his mind. The envelopes were not a gesture. They were a question he had been carrying for a long time and had run out of ways to avoid asking. Monday arrived cold, the way Chicago mornings arrive in November, flat and gray, a wind coming off the lake that didn't negotiate. At 7 a.m., the elevator opened and 3 adults walked out of the Whitmore building carrying whatever they had packed. Grant did not go down. He stood at the window and watched them emerge onto Michigan Avenue and move in 3 directions. He finished his coffee. He did not check the family group chat. He had silenced it. Fletcher had packed a rolling carry-on. He flagged a cab before he reached the corner. Douglas had a backpack and his laptop, which he would discover that evening was useless without the hotspot his phone plan no longer supported. Nora had a canvas tote, a water bottle, and a black notebook she'd owned since college. She turned south and walked. Fletcher Whitmore had not paid for a hotel room with cash since a backpacking trip at 22 that he had ended 4 days early by booking a flight home. He stood at the front desk of the Marriott on Wacker Drive at 9 in the morning and watched the desk agent run his card once, then twice, then offer a 3rd terminal with the particular professional sympathy of someone who has delivered this news before. The card was declined. Fletcher stood very still for a moment. He had the specific posture of a man waiting for the situation to correct itself. When it did not, he stepped away from the desk with his carry-on and stood near the entrance and took stock. He had $100, a phone that received calls but could no longer access email or the internet, and a contact list that he now opened for the first time in years, not to delegate but to ask for something. He called 4 people before one picked up. A college friend named Price, who lived in Wicker Park and agreed without making too much of it, which Fletcher would later understand was its own kind of generosity. By noon, he was sitting in a guest room with an IKEA bed frame and a view of a parking structure. He ordered lunch from a burger place around the corner from muscle memory, sat down to eat, and had $62 left before he processed what he'd spent. He did not do the math. He sat and ate his burger and didn't do the math, and that, though he wouldn't see it yet, was already the problem. Douglas lasted until Tuesday afternoon before the performance fell apart. He had spent the first day in the library, which was free and had Wi-Fi, drafting what he told himself was a pivot strategy. By Tuesday morning, the strategy had not produced money, and he had $91 left after 2 meals. He found a pitch competition listed on mine. Entry was $45, Prize was $500, and it was happening that afternoon in River North. Douglas paid the entry fee and spent 2 hours preparing a deck on a borrowed laptop. He came in fourth in a field of 6. There was no prize for fourth. He walked out into the November wind with $46 and the specific tiredness that comes from performing competence to people who are simultaneously performing the same thing back at you. He stood on the sidewalk and calculated, for the first time since Sunday, that $46 in Chicago in November did not cover a warm place to sleep. He found a 24-hour diner on Halsted and spent $8 on coffee and eggs, and sat in the booth until midnight when the overnight manager, a broad-shouldered man named Franklin, who wore the same expression for every situation, told him the booth was needed. Douglas spent Tuesday night in the diner's entryway, which was technically heated, sitting on his backpack with his jacket pulled up, doing calculations on a piece of paper that kept arriving at the same number, not enough. Nora had been at the library on State Street since it opened at 9. She found a table near the north window, set down her tote, took out the black notebook, and wrote across the top of the first page, $100, 7 days, equals $14, 27 sashday. Below it, she drew 3 columns. She labeled them food, transport, shelter. She looked at the third column for a moment, then drew a single line through it and wrote beside it, solve by tonight. She spent the morning on the library's public computers, not browsing, searching. She found 3 overnight shelter options within 2 miles. She found a community kitchen on the west side that served dinner 5 nights a week. She found a city transit week pass for $28 that would cost her less than daily fares if she moved around efficiently. She bought it. On the way out, she stopped at a corner grocery and bought a jar of peanut butter, a loaf of whole wheat bread, a banana, and a bottle of water for $9.40. She ate 2 slices of bread standing on the sidewalk watching the light change on State Street, then walked back in and recorded the purchase to the penny. She had $62.60. 6 days. The numbers were not comfortable, but they were workable. She went back inside and kept searching. By Wednesday, Fletcher had $31 and a problem he couldn't network his way out of. He had worked through his contacts the way you work through a punch list, methodically and without sentiment. He had reached out to 6 people and received 4 polite non-answers and 2 genuine offers of help that he couldn't bring himself to accept because accepting them would have required explaining the situation, and explaining the situation would have required a vocabulary he did not currently possess. He sat in Price's guest room on Wednesday afternoon and looked at his phone and understood, slowly and without drama, that he did not know how to ask for something he actually needed. He had known how to ask for things his whole life. He was good at asking, in meetings, in negotiations, on calls. He had been trained to ask for things in ways that didn't sound like asking. Every request framed as an opportunity, every need presented as a proposition. He walked to a park on Wednesday morning and sat on a bench and opened his contact list to the beginning and started again. 3 hours later, he had not found a single person he was certain would show up for him if the Whitmore name meant nothing. The relationships had always felt like his. Looking at them from this side of the fence, he could see that most of them belonged to the name. Price tested Wednesday evening. A cousin was coming to visit. The room would be needed by Friday. Fletcher heard it for what it was. He had $31, 2 nights of confirmed shelter, and no plan for after. It was the first time in 11 years that he didn't have a plan for after. Douglas woke up Thursday on a cot at a warming shelter on the west side, which he had found at 11 p.m. the night before after 40 minutes of increasingly cold walking. The shelter was operated by a church and had 30 cots, a water dispenser, and a box of donated winter coats by the door. He had taken a coat, a navy peacoat slightly too large, that smelled of cedar and belonged to someone's previous winter. He lay on the cot Thursday morning with $46 in his pocket. He'd eaten nothing on Wednesday to save it, and thought about money. He had always thought about money. He had thought about it the way people think about weather, as context, as background, as something that affected your plans but that you didn't personally control. He had never thought about it the way he was thinking about it now, as a specific number attached to a specific number of hours, each one costing something. On the nightstand beside the cot was a laminated sheet with the shelter's daily schedule. Breakfast at 7. Check out at 8. The breakfast was powdered eggs and toast and coffee, and Douglas ate all of it. Across the table sat a man named Wendell. Wendell was 63, had been a journeyman plumber for 25 years, and had spent the last 8 months cycling between shelters and a part-time job, washing dishes at a restaurant that let him work 4 days a week, because the owner, a Vietnamese woman named May, had known his late wife, and felt that counted for something. Douglas did not ask Wendell about his circumstances. He was not sure how to ask without it coming out wrong, but Wendell told him anyway, the way some people tell things, not because they need sympathy, but because the facts of a life are just the facts, and carrying them alone is heavier than it needs to be. "Used to make good money," Wendell said. He was buttering his toast with the focused care of someone who had decided that this piece of toast deserved his full attention. "Pension got cut when the company folded. Wife had heart surgery. You know how that goes." Douglas did not know how that went. He said so. Wendell looked at him the way experienced people look at honesty they didn't expect. "No," he said. "I don't suppose you do. Not unkindly. Just accurately." Douglas wrote something in the margin of his paper calculations that night. He didn't know why he wrote it. He was not a person who wrote things in margins. It said, "He still butters the toast." Nora found the community kitchen on Wednesday evening, a church basement on the west side that smelled like industrial dishwasher steam and something that might have been vegetable soup. She took a tray and sat at a long folding table and ate slowly and looked at the room. At the far end of the table sat a woman alone, 60, maybe older. Gray hair pulled back in a clip, a pair of reading glasses on a lanyard around her neck, and a tote bag from the Chicago Public Library beside her chair. She was eating with the methodical unhurriedness of someone who had learned not to rush through things that were free. Nora did not sit next to her to extract something. She sat near her because the rest of the table was loud and she was tired. She said hello. The woman said hello. Her name was Evelyn. Evelyn had been a court reporter for 26 years. She had been good at it, good at the stillness it required, good at the concentration, good at disappearing into the background of other people's worst moments and recording them with precision. She had retired at 62 on the understanding that her savings and her late husband's pension would carry her. They had not. The pension had been attached to a fund that restructured badly. The savings had been spent on his care before he died and on the period of not knowing how to function that came afterward. "I'm not ashamed of this," Evelyn said, meaning the community kitchen, meaning the tote bag, meaning the current version of her life. "I was ashamed for a while, then I got tired of shame. It takes so much energy." Nora asked about the reading glasses. Evelyn said she'd been working her way through the complete works of Edith Wharton. "At this pace," Evelyn said, "I'll finish sometime in the spring." Nora asked whether that felt like enough. Evelyn thought about it. "Some days," she said. "Some days the book is the whole day. That's enough." Nora wrote in her notebook that night, the whole day being the whole day. Thursday was the hard day for all three of them, in the ways that hard days are hard when you're finally out of the ability to pretend otherwise. Fletcher sat in Cary Park, not the Seattle one, but a small triangle of green space near the lakefront in Lincoln Park, on a bench with his carry-on beside him, and $31 in his pocket and 2 nights of confirmed shelter before the answer ran out. He called his father. Voicemail. He called again. Voicemail. He called a third time and waited for the beep and said, without any of the registers he normally used, "No authority, no case building, no performance of having everything handled. Dad, I need to talk to you. I don't know what comes next." He stopped. He had never said that sentence. He had never had to. Every version of what comes next had always been supplied before he finished asking. He held the phone and sat with what was left when you took away the company, the title, the name, the plan. A 31-year-old man on a bench in November with 31 year in a carry-on that was starting to look like a very expensive way to carry 3 days of clothes. The weight of it arrived not with drama, but with a kind of heavy quiet. He sat inside it without moving for a long time. Douglas spent Thursday in the shelter, which he was not supposed to do. Checkout was at 8, but Franklin, the overnight manager who had also worked at the diner and apparently worked everywhere simultaneously, told him quietly that if he stayed in the back room and didn't make noise, there wasn't anyone counting. Douglas stayed. He sat in the back room with Wendell, who was also staying, and they talked for most of the day. Wendell told him about the plumbing work, the satisfaction of it, finding the problem, tracing it back to its source, fixing the thing at the cause rather than the symptom. Most of the time, Wendell said, the expensive fix and the cheap fix are the same fix, just depends when you do it. Douglas wrote that down too. By 4 o'clock, Douglas had $46 and a specific knowledge that he could not keep sleeping at the shelter past the weekend because the weekend beds were reserved by lottery and he hadn't entered. He could get a hostel bed for one night with what he had. He had enough for 2 days of food. He had the address of a woman named Margaret from an app that matched volunteer workers to short-term service jobs. She ran a community center on Pilsen and needed someone to move furniture and paint a storage room, $13 an hour starting Friday. He had found this listing on Thursday morning. He had not called. He sat in the shelter's back room with Wendell and knew he was choosing not to call, and knew why. He was not a person who painted storage rooms for $13 an hour. He had told himself this with some version of that sentence all day. He was still telling it to himself at 9 o'clock when the shelter's lights went down and he lay on the cot and looked at the ceiling. The specific quality of a bad decision made with full knowledge is different from the quality of a mistake. A mistake carries surprise. This carried only the precise weight of knowing better. Friday morning, Douglas was at the community center in Pilsen at 7:45. Margaret Okonkwo looked up from behind a desk stacked with clipboards and said nothing about the fact that she'd listed the job 3 days ago. She pointed at a storage room full of metal shelving units and folding tables. "Start there," she said. He started there. What happened over the next several hours was not dramatic. He moved shelving. He painted 2 walls a color the can called warm sand, and that looked, once dried, like every institutional storage room wall in America. A man came in around noon to drop off a donation of children's books, and Margaret sorted them with a speed that suggested she had been sorting donated items for a very long time and had made peace with the fact that peace was not the same as preference. At some point, Douglas was given a task he had not expected, matching each book to an age range and placing it on the right shelf. He did this slowly, reading the back covers, sometimes the first page, sometimes setting one aside because it seemed particularly good and he wanted to make sure it was findable. Margaret walked by once and saw him doing it and did not say anything. She watched him for a moment and kept walking. At 5 o'clock, she set $52 on the folding table beside him. 4 hours at $13, which Douglas did not correct because he had been there since 7:45. He folded the bills and put them in his jacket. "Same time Monday?" he said. Margaret looked at him the way she had looked at the stack of children's books, not evaluating, just measuring. 7:30, she said. "If you're late, I start without you." He was there at 7:15 on Saturday and Sunday. By Monday morning, he had worked parts of 3 days, kept his food budget to near nothing using the community center's noon meal, and had $89 in his pocket, more than he'd started with. On Sunday afternoon, Wendell came by the community center. He was not there for Douglas. He was dropping off a bag of tools he no longer had use for: pipe cutters, a basin wrench, a level, a set of drill bits in a labeled case. Margaret received them without ceremony and put them in the storage room that Douglas had just painted. Douglas watched Wendell set the bag down. Wendell did it carefully. Not like you put down something you're relieved to be rid of, but like you put down something that still matters to you, that you're trusting to someone else's care. That night, Douglas wrote one line in the margin of his calculation sheet. It said, "The tools don't stop meaning something just because you can't use them." Fletcher's Friday began in the library. He did not plan to go there. He had walked out of Price's building on Friday morning with his carry-on and $31 and no particular destination. His feet took him north, and then east, and then through the library's revolving door, and he found a table near the window because it had good light and sat down. He did not open his phone. He did not attempt to look productive. He sat. Around him, the library moved at its own pace. A teenager in headphones doing homework. An elderly man with a cart of audiobooks, navigating the aisles with the patience of someone who had found the particular section of the world that suited him and intended to stay. A woman with a toddler in a stroller, reading to the child in a voice pitched for the child and no one else. Fletcher watched them without absorbing them. Near the end of the first hour, a woman sat down at the table across from him and spread out a large architectural drawing and began making notes in the margins with a pencil she'd tucked behind her ear. She worked with a focused intensity that didn't require silence but produced it, the way certain kinds of concentration are contagious. Fletcher found himself watching her work, not intrusively, just watching the way hands move when they know exactly what they're doing. There was no performance in it, no awareness of being observed. She was doing a thing because the thing needed doing, and she was there, and she knew how. He had run an acquisitions division for 4 years. He had sat in 300 meetings. He had signed his name to 47 deals. He could not remember the last time he had done something because the thing needed doing, and he was simply the person there to do it. He sat for the second hour and did not arrive at an answer. But a question arrived. A quiet one, the kind that doesn't announce itself. He left the library at noon and walked back toward the street with his carry-on and his $31, and for the first time all week he was not heading somewhere in particular. He was walking because the walking itself was the thing, and the city was there, and he was in it. And that was enough for a Friday in November. Monday morning, Grant opened the gate at 7. Fletcher arrived first at 9:15. He came in the front door, set his carry-on down in the entryway, and stood in the kitchen without speaking. Grant put coffee on. Fletcher looked at his hands. They had a small cut on the right one, a corner of the carry-on zipper caught wrong 2 days ago. "I thought I knew everyone who mattered," Fletcher said finally. "I didn't know any of them." He wasn't looking for a response. He was saying it out loud for the first time, which was a different thing from knowing it. Grant set a mug in front of him and said nothing. Douglas came through the back door at 10:50. He set 2 things on the table before he sat down. The first was a folded stack of bills, a mix of 20s, 10s, 5s, totaling $89, more than he'd started with. The second was a printed email from Margaret Okonkwo confirming his Tuesday shift. His hands were open on the table. He wasn't holding his phone. "I want to keep going," he said, "to the community center, not just this week." He said it the way a person says something when they know it might be inconvenient and they're saying it anyway. The question in it was real. Grant looked at the money. He looked at the email. He looked at his son's hands. In 28 years, Douglas had announced things, assumed things, claimed things. This was the first time a sentence had contained an actual request, with the possibility of no built into it. Grant said, "Yes." Nora came home at 2:10 in the afternoon. She set her jacket on the hook by the front door, a habit Grant had noticed for years, unremarked upon, and placed 2 things on the kitchen table. A small stack of coins totaling $4.20, and the black notebook, open. Grant sat down and read it. He read the budget on the first page, the columns. The word shelter crossed out. He read every expense, 7 days of purchases, each one recorded to the cent. He read the lines between the numbers, the whole day being the whole day. Below it, on the following page, in handwriting he recognized as careful but unperformed, she wasn't invisible. She just stopped announcing herself. And on the final page, a name. Evelyn Marsh, former court reporter, currently residing at Transitional Housing on West Jackson, available for part-time work. Excellent memory and demonstrated precision under pressure. Note, she asked for nothing. This is why she should be asked. Below the name and address, below the address, a single line underlined once. Not charity, work. Grant closed the notebook. He sat with it under his hand for a long moment, the way you sit with something when you've been waiting for it and it arrives in a form you didn't imagine. He reached into the drawer of the kitchen table, his wife Diane's table, moved from the house in Evanston when she died, and took out a small object. An enamel pin, a simple thing, shaped like a compass rose that had been Diane's. He had kept it in the drawer for 11 years. He set it beside the notebook. Nora looked at it. She did not reach for it. She seemed to understand that it was not being given yet. It was being placed beside something to see whether the 2 things belonged together. They did. Grant drove all 3 of them out to the south side the next morning without explaining where they were going. The three of them sat in the back, shoulders nearly touching. The first time in years they had occupied that particular closeness. None of them spoke. Each was still carrying the week somewhere. In a cut on a hand, in the memory of an open coat box, in 5 words written in a notebook's margin. The building was a former warehouse on Pershing Road. Chain link on 2 sides, a loading dock that hadn't been used in a decade, weeds coming up through the expansion joints in the concrete. A sign on the fence, blue text on white, Future Site Whitmore Community Trade Center. Grant had purchased it 18 months ago. He had told no one, not his board, not his CFO, not his attorneys, not his children. He stood at the fence and told them what it would be. Ground floor, 4 trade workshops. Electrical, plumbing, carpentry, building systems. For people coming out of shelters, parole, medical debt, the kind of circumstances that don't make the news but show up every morning in city data. Above that, 40 units of permanent supportive housing, rents fixed regardless of what happened to the surrounding neighborhood. It won't make money, Grant said. It's not supposed to. It's supposed to give someone a key. He stood and looked at all 3 of them. I didn't send you out to punish you, he said. I sent you out because I needed to know whether any of you could see what I've been watching for 2 years. He let that sit. Then he asked them each the same question. If I handed you the keys to this building tomorrow, what would you do first? Fletcher answered first. He talked about permitting, contractor relationships, the timeline from foundation inspection to CO. He gave a schedule. It was accurate and complete, and he heard it leaving his mouth and understood exactly what it was missing. He stopped mid-sentence. He looked at the weeds coming up through the concrete. He did not fill the silence with more words. That was different from how he would have handled it a week ago. Grant noted the silence. He said nothing. Douglas was looking toward the back of the lot when his turn came, looking at the windows of the building visible over the fence, looking at a set of mailboxes mounted beside a door on the adjacent building, the small domestic permanence of them. He said quietly, people need to know their mail is safe. You should have lockboxes on every unit door before anyone moves in. It was not about return on investment. It was about a specific man on a cot in a shelter, counting the contents of his jacket pocket with nowhere to keep a thing that belonged to him. Wendell had not said this. Douglas had simply watched him and understood. Grant felt something shift. He had not anticipated Douglas. Of the 3, Douglas had seemed furthest from any of this. Most sealed inside his own performance of potential, most committed to the idea of building something while avoiding the actual weight of building anything. And yet here he stood, looking at a row of mailboxes, thinking about what it meant to have a place where something of yours could wait for you. Nora walked through a gap in the fence without asking. She moved around the perimeter the way you move when you're listening to a space, not measuring but attending. She crouched at the corner where the concrete met the loading dock, pressed her palm flat to the ground, and held it there. Then she stood, opened the notebook, and drew. When she brought it back, the ground floor was sketched in 4 sections, each labeled by trade. Beside the electrical section, in the same careful handwriting that had recorded every cent over 7 days, was a name. Evelyn Marsh. Documentation and records. Currently at West Jackson Transitional Housing. Note, has spent 26 years disappearing into the background of other people's worst moments. Give her a desk, give her a title, let her stop disappearing. Not a concept hire, not a bracket on an org chart. A specific person at a specific address already placed inside the structure as if the structure needed her to stand correctly. Grant read the name twice. When he spoke, his voice had the particular evenness of a person who has been waiting for something and is now working to receive it without letting the wait show. You didn't just get through the week, he said. Nora said, she got through more than a week. I just paid attention. 7 words. Grant sat with them the way he sat with things that mattered, slowly, more than once, until the full weight of them arrived. He stood in the weeds on Pershing Road on a Tuesday in November, and understood that what he had hoped to find was exactly what he had found, and that it had cost each of them something real, and that the cost was part of what made it real, and that he would not have traded any of it, not even the Wednesday morning when his eldest son sat alone on a park bench and said for the first time in his life that he didn't know what came next. that had also been a beginning. The trade center opened on a Monday morning in March without ceremony. Evelyn Marsh arrived before anyone else. She had a set of keys on a lanyard, the first set of keys with her name on the tag in 4 years. She unlocked the front door and turned on the overhead lights and stood in the entryway for a moment, listening to the building settle around her. She walked to her desk, a real one, solid oak, surplus from a city office sale, and sat down and turned on the computer and opened the intake documentation she had spent 3 weeks designing. Every field labeled in plain language, every form tested on someone who had never seen a form like it before, every redundancy removed. On her desk beside the monitor was a photograph, not a framed one, a small printed one, taped to a card. Edith Wharton, from some early edition cover. Below it, in Nora's handwriting, "Some days the book is the whole day. That's enough." Evelyn looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at the door, because people would be arriving, and the forms were ready, and the work was what it had always been, paying close attention to someone else's worst moment and helping them find the record of it. Fletcher returned to Whitmore Capital, but not to the same version of the role. He proposed a small business advisory program, not to the board, to his father, and accepted a reduction in his own compensation to fund it through its first year. He still wore the same shoes. He walked to more meetings now, sometimes 12 blocks, sometimes more. His feet had learned the city's actual distances in the way feet learn things when they have no other choice. Douglas split his time between the trade center's operations and the community center in Pilsen. He managed supply coordination and materials budgets, which turned out to be closer to plumbing than finance, tracing problems back to their source, fixing things at the cause rather than the symptom. When people asked what he did, he said he helped to make sure people had what they needed. The sentence fit well enough that he stopped feeling like he needed to say something larger. On Tuesdays, he was at the community center. Margaret Okonkwo had not asked him to come back officially. She had simply continued listing his shifts on the schedule, which he had learned to interpret as its own form of approval. Nora rented an apartment 6 blocks from the trade center. The black notebook from the week of $100 was full by April. A second one lived on her desk beside the compass rose pin, which her father had placed in her hand the morning after the Pershing Road visit, without ceremony. She kept it the way you keep things that are not about the object itself but about the particular morning that made the object matter. Evelyn had an apartment on the 2nd floor with a window facing east. On her nightstand, a photograph of her late husband taken at a garden somewhere. She couldn't remember where, just that it had been warm and they hadn't been in a hurry. Beside it, a library card in a small frame. Chicago Public Library, issued 1987. She had replaced it 5 times. She kept the oldest one as evidence that some things stay constant even when everything around them changes. On an afternoon in March, Grant sat in the study of the Winnetka house. The light came through the west window the way it does in the middle of the country in early spring. Tentative, not yet sure of itself, but arriving. He opened the center drawer of Diane's table. Empty. He had put the compass rosepin in Nora's hand 3 months ago, and the drawer had been empty since. He did not feel the absence as loss. He felt it as the particular lightness of something set down in the right place, after being carried for longer than it should have been. He had built a company worth more than he had intended. He would keep building. But what he was building now did not appear in any quarterly report. It was measured in a woman who arrived before anyone else because the work was worth arriving early for. It was measured in a son who asked instead of announced. It was measured in 7 words, said on a November morning at a chain-link fence on Pershing Road. He closed the drawer. Outside the window, Chicago moved at its own pace, wide and unsentimental and full of people carrying things no one else could see. For the first time in a long time, Grant Whitmore looked at it without keeping score. The following morning, before anyone arrived at the trade center, Evelyn stood alone in the intake office. The lights were off. The room held the smell of the previous week's work. Coffee, paper. The particular warmth of a space where people had sat and been listened to. On her desk, a stack of completed intake forms from the previous week, 14 of them, each one representing a person who had walked through the door carrying something they needed to set down. She sat. She turned on the desk lamp, not the overhead lights, just the lamp. She opened the intake log to a new page, wrote the date in the top right corner, and waited. Outside, March was still deciding what kind of day it intended to be. A bus stopped at the corner, opened its doors, waited, closed its doors, left. Evelyn uncapped her pen, looked at the blank page, and was ready. I keep coming back to the moment Douglas wrote 4 words in the margin of a crumpled piece of paper. Not in a journal, not in a meeting room, on a sheet of budget calculations at a warming shelter on the west side of Chicago in a coat that didn't belong to him, next to a man named Wendell who still buttered his toast like it mattered. He still butters the toast. That's the thing about character. It doesn't announce itself. It shows up in how a person treats a single piece of toast when there's no one watching, no audience, no performance to give. Wendell had lost his pension, his wife, his house, and most of what the world uses to measure a man, and he still brought care to the smallest act of the morning. Douglas saw it, and something in him shifted, not because someone told him to shift, but because he was finally in a room where pretending cost more than it was worth. That's how I understand what Grant was really doing when he put $100 in 3 envelopes and changed the gate code at 4 in the morning. He wasn't punishing anyone. He was removing the insulation. Because insulation, the kind money builds around a person over years, doesn't just protect you from cold. It protects you from knowing what cold feels like. And if you don't know what cold feels like, you can't recognize it in someone else's face. You can't see Wendell. You can't see Evelyn. You walk past them every day on the way to a meeting that will not remember you. Fletcher spent most of the week trying to solve a problem with the same tools that had made the problem invisible to him in the first place. He reached into his contact list looking for relationships and found receipts. That's a hard thing to discover about yourself at 31. Hard, and also clarifying. The honesty of it, I don't know what comes next, was the first genuinely intelligent thing he said all week. Not intelligent in the way of strategy or sequence, intelligent in the way of someone who has finally stopped performing and started paying attention. That kind of honesty takes more courage than most people give it credit for. And Nora, she didn't survive the week so much as she inhabited it. She budgeted to the penny, yes, but that's not what I think about when I think about her. I think about her sitting across from Evelyn in a church basement, not extracting information, just being present, not filling the ends of sentences. Just listening long enough for someone who had spent years making herself invisible to become visible again. That's not a skill you can teach in a classroom. It's something you have to choose over and over in small moments that nobody grades. What these 3 people were asked to do, and what most of us are asked to do in our own versions of that November week, is develop the part of ourselves that doesn't show up on a resume. The part that knows right from wrong when wrong is easier, the part that stays curious when certainty would be more comfortable. The part that keeps going on a Thursday morning when every reasonable voice is saying the bench is fine, the bench is warm enough, the door can wait. Grant found what he was looking for, not in the form you expected and not without cost, but real. The real kind is never without cost. That's what makes it real. Evelyn uncapped her pen and looked at a blank page and was ready. I think about that a lot. After everything, after the pension, the hospital, the years of carrying something no one could see, she was still ready. She showed up before anyone else. She did the work. That's the whole thing, maybe. Show up, do the work, let what you see change you.